Welcome to the third video in my series. This is all about identifying photographs that help you with your family history. This is part 3 and this is a brief case study regarding the photograph I have in my collection. Here is the photograph. It's a black and white photograph in a cardboard frame, and at the front somebody's written their names: Tom, Harry, George and Sydney, and we also have the name of the studio in the bottom left hand corner. That gives me my first clue. The studio, R.J. Watson, on Anley Road in Hull, was active from 1890 to 1920s. So we know that this picture must have been taken in that time period. I also know from genealogical research that all my uncles were born in the 1890s. And looking at their ages, I could do a brief date already. But let's look at the photograph in a little bit more detail. On the back, somebody's written Sydney, George, Harry and Tom. Now this is in a different order than what's written in the front. So clearly I need to do some investigation to find out who is who and in what order they've been taken. In a book in the hand of the sailor, after using a magnifying glass, I can make out that it's Ben Hare. Ben Hare was published in 1880, so that doesn't give me a big clue as to when the photograph was taken. It's clearly an old studio prop. Let's start with the sailors. In this case, colorization has really helped me pick out some of the details. And from my own investigation, I know that Harry and George was in the Navy, so it's clearly Harry and George. Harry was demobbed on the 21st of January 1920, and George was demobbed on the 13th of May 1919. So the fact that they're both in uniform means that this photograph must have been taken before the 13th of May 1919. One of the sailors is clearly a stoker. He worked in the engine room. This is the trade badge. And the same sailor has got a good conduct stripe. This was awarded after 3 years of good service. A second stripe was awarded after 8 years. So both George and Harry enlisted in 1913, so the photograph is after 1916. And then at the bottom of both the sailors' sleeves are World War I service stripes, one stripe for each year of active service during the war. Now both have got 4 stripes. World War I started in July 1914, so the photograph must have been taken from July 1918 or later. So just from the uniforms, we can date the photograph as between July 1918 and May 1919. Let's go ahead and try and identify who is who here. We know it's Harry and George, and luckily I've got some other photographs of George later in life that I know positively have been identified as George. I loaded these photographs up into Google Photographs. I've got an identification algorithm, and it maps it to the sailor on the left. So now we know that George is on the left and Harry is on the right. Now let's go ahead and try and identify the other 2 brothers sat on the left and the right. I know from my own research that both these brothers also saw active service. The Germans captured Sydney on the Western Front in November 1916. He was a prisoner of war for full 3 years. He's repatriated to the UK on the 14th of January 1919, and less than 2 weeks later he married his future wife. He was not known to have been wounded, but it was the case that many British prisoners held by the Germans complained that they did not get enough to eat and came home very thin. On the other hand, Thomas was badly wounded in Gallipoli, probably at the Battle of Silva in August 1915. And by 1917 he was shown to be a military pensioner. I don't have the exact discharge date, but I expect it was as early as 1915 with his extensive wounds. Only one of the people in the photograph are wearing a Civil War badge for wounded veterans, and that's the person on the right. It would appear that the person on the left is much thinner, and the person on the right is wearing a Civil War badge. So we can say it's Sydney on the left who is very thin, and Thomas on the right is wearing his Civil War badge. Sydney and Thomas are both in civilian clothes, and it appears the picture was taken after the 14th of January 1919, after Sydney's return to England. Now looking at Sydney's left hand, there doesn't appear to be a wedding ring, assuming he wore a wedding ring. Then there's a possibility that his picture was taken at or before his wedding between the 14th and 25th of January. As neither Sydney or Thomas are wearing a boutonniere, it's probably not his actual wedding day. On the table in front of them, there's an open book that looks a little bit like a wedding registry, but it's impossible to say what it is. Now, having examined the photograph, we can make some conclusions about it. We can say, left to right, the men in the photograph are Sydney, George, Harry and Thomas. We know that the photograph was taken at the studio of I.J. Watson on Anleby Road in Hull, definitely between the 14th of January 1919 and the 13th of May 1919. And it's very possible, in fact almost likely, that the photograph coincides with Sydney's return to England and his marriage on the 25th of January 1919, so sometime between the 14th of January and the 25th of January 1919. It was incredibly lucky that all four brothers who served and saw action during World War I came home safely. Thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope you found it interesting and informative, along with the other two videos regarding photographs in your family history collection. If you've got any questions or comments, please write them below and I'll be sure to answer them. In the meantime, have a great day and good luck with your research.